Something unusual is unfolding in Washington right now, and it isn't being driven by the usual political opponents. What's happening is more unsettling than that. For the first time in a long while, resistance is rising from inside Donald Trump's own party. Not loudly, not through press conferences or viral speeches, but quietly, deliberately, as Republican lawmakers begin pushing back against the power he is trying to hold on to at all costs. Emergency declarations are being floated, war-level language is creeping into public remarks, and behind closed doors, there is a level of anxiety that rarely leaks out of Capitol Hill. Congress, sensing that the moment is slipping towards something irreversible, is beginning to draw lines that were previously left untouched. This is not just another political clash or a headline designed to burn for a day and disappear. It is a real test of whether American power is ultimately governed by law or by the instincts of one man, and what unfolds next could shape how authority works in the United States long after the noise fades, which is why this moment deserves more than a passing glance. Picture Washington late at night, when the city is usually quiet and procedural, but suddenly isn't. Phones light up across Capitol Hill, staffers speak in hushed tones. Senators refresh their screens, rereading messages just to be sure they are interpreting them correctly. The tension isn't coming from Democrats or the media, it's coming from the Oval Office. The President of the United States is furious, and the target of that anger is his own party. For the first time in years, the pressure is not coming from protesters outside the gates, but from within the walls of power itself. History shows that this is where danger often begins, because internal resistance forces leaders to confront limits they prefer to pretend do not exist. Right now, Republicans are pushing back against Donald Trump, and this isn't the familiar spectacle of MAGA infighting or anonymous leaks meant to spook donors. This runs deeper and colder. It strikes at the one thing Trump believes he cannot survive without: unchecked authority. The significance of this revolt is not simply that some supporters feel betrayed by broken promises. Whether those promises involved avoiding new wars, lowering costs of living, or releasing long-teased disclosures that never quite materialized. The deeper issue is that Republican lawmakers themselves are starting to move against the very powers Trump is determined to preserve. When the internal guardrails of a system begin to activate, presidents rarely respond with restraint. They escalate, they dramatize, they declare emergencies. And that pattern is now playing out in real time, as a presidency leans heavily on spectacle and crisis language to shield itself from internal collapse. At the center of this tension is a reality so unsettling that even seasoned Washington figures struggle to say it plainly. The President of the United States has openly entertained the idea of using military force in ways that could drag the country into conflict, not with a distant enemy, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in blunt terms, the impact was immediate, because stripped of branding and bravado, the scenario stops sounding theoretical. It starts sounding dangerous. These statements can no longer be waved away as jokes or exaggerations, because the stakes are too high to dismiss them. Greenland is not an empty square on a real estate map. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's central principle is collective defense. That means any military action against that territory is not symbolic posturing. It creates a legal and strategic nightmare that, in theory, places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers now feel compelled to explain this basic reality to the public says a great deal about how far the conversation has drifted from normal boundaries. No American voter signed up for a presidency that risks armed conflict with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. And yet here the country is, parsing offhand remarks, weighing hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it swings open. Understanding this backlash requires understanding how Trump views the world. He does not process geopolitics through alliances, treaties, or shared security commitments. He sees leverage, property, deals that can be forced if enough pressure is applied. That mindset might succeed in a boardroom, but on the global stage it costs lives. Republican senators understand this. They know that once a president frames military action as a real option, the machinery begins to move, regardless of whether Congress approves. That is why the War Powers Act suddenly became more than a theoretical constitutional debate. It became an emergency brake. And when that brake was pulled, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting unilateral presidential action, the response from Trump was not persuasion or compromise, it was rage. The reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins was not really about a single vote. It was about something far more jarring, the realization that loyalty has limits. Even within his own party, there are lines that cannot be crossed without resistance. For Trump, that resistance feels existential. His strategy depends on projecting inevitability, strength, and total control. Nothing undermines that faster than members of your own party publicly saying no, especially when the issue at stake involves war, authority, and constitutional boundaries. And this is where the story begins to accelerate, because when Trump meets resistance, he does not retreat. He reframes. He reaches for the language of emergency, not just as a policy tool, but as a political weapon, setting the stage for everything that follows. Faced with pushback from within his own ranks, Trump does what he has always done when challenged. He shifts the frame. He does not slow down or soften his approach. Instead, he escalates, reaching for the language of crisis and urgency, presenting extraordinary measures not merely as policy choices but as necessities demanded by the moment. In this context, the declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits a familiar pattern. It allows him to cast himself as the lone defender of national security, while portraying lawmakers who question him as reckless obstacles standing in the way of American strength. On the surface, the move is presented as decisive leadership. Beneath that surface, however, the reality is far more complicated, involving long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would likely flow first to multinational energy companies rather than to ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the objective. Control has. Emergencies change the rules. They centralize authority, compress debate, and redirect attention away from uncomfortable questions. And few things are more uncomfortable for this administration right now than the growing scrutiny over stalled transparency efforts. Promised disclosures that were supposed to arrive quickly have slowed to a crawl. Documents that were framed as urgent have been delayed. Oversight actions that could have been initiated proactively have instead required bipartisan pressure to move forward at all. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse begin speaking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and missed timelines, it signals something important, not an accusation, not a conclusion, but concern that the basic processes of accountability are breaking down. And concern is dangerous for an administration that relies on speed, spectacle, and dominance to maintain control of the narrative. Trump's political survival does not depend solely on winning arguments. It depends on exhausting the public, overwhelming the information space, and ensuring that no single controversy receives sustained attention. That is why the Republican revolt, the war powers fight, the emergency declarations, and the stalled disclosures are not separate stories. They are the same story, viewed from different angles. A presidency attempting to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos, and Republicans who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of silence. They are weighing institutional damage against party loyalty and realizing that if they do not act now, the system they depend on may look unrecognizable later. Once a president openly suggests that he is guided primarily by personal judgment rather than law, treaties, or precedent, the issue stops being partisan. It becomes structural, and that is the moment Washington finds itself in. Behind closed doors, Republican lawmakers are asking a question they never expected to ask. Is stopping Trump an act of betrayal or an act of preservation? History does not remember who defended power most loudly. It remembers who intervened when the rules bent past their breaking point. This revolt, quiet in some places and explosive in others, may be the first real sign that the internal guardrails are being tested, not by the opposition, but by those who understand exactly how dangerous unchecked authority can become when it is wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and the language of permanent emergency. As this internal rebellion deepens, the focus begins to shift away from Trump's public statements and toward Republican behavior behind the scenes, away from social media outrage and carefully scripted remarks, and toward private meetings, phone calls, and strategic calculations. There is a growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency, but with a leader who interprets every institutional limit as a personal insult. That realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. When the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican votes, it was not a lapse in discipline or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate move by senators who understand that once unilateral military threats become normalized, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. This fear is not ideological, it is constitutional. The War Powers Act exists for precisely these moments when presidential instinct begins to outrun systemic safeguards. Trump's reaction to this resistance, marked by profanity, intimidation, and threats of political retaliation, only deepened concern that his decision-making process is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and obsession with legacy. Legacy is a critical word here. Trump's fixation on how he will be remembered as dominant, transformative, and historically consequential has increasingly collided with the reality that his promises have not produced stability, restraint, or prosperity. And when the promise of no new wars begins to collapse under the weight of aggressive rhetoric, even loyal supporters start to fracture. Wars are not abstract ideas to voters. They carry costs, risks, and consequences. Republicans facing re-election understand that no amount of branding can sell a conflict with allies as a victory. That is why Trump's growing reliance on emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like panic. Emergencies allow him to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and reframe opposition as sabotage. This tactic has a long global history. Leaders who feel their authority slipping often reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the political moment in their favor. In Trump's case, the Venezuelan oil emergency serves as a textbook example of how economic assets are reframed as national security imperatives, even when the benefits are distant, uncertain, and largely corporate. And as lawmakers on both sides of the aisle quietly acknowledge this, the distance between the president and his party continues to grow. Trump's relationship with his own party has increasingly shifted from uneasy cooperation to open tension because he does not simply seek support, he demands submission. When senators assert independence, he interprets it not as governance but as betrayal. Publicly, he threatens their political futures. Privately, he still depends on them for confirmations, legislation, and the institutional cover that keeps a presidency functioning. That contradiction exposes the fragility of his position, because power rooted in fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. And that is exactly what is beginning to happen as Republican senators quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide where lines must finally be drawn, lines that once seemed impossible to draw without ending a political career. This internal calculation is driven by a broader and more unsettling concern. Trump's rhetoric about law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic. It is becoming operational. When a president suggests that personal judgment outweighs international law or constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview in which rules exist only when they are convenient. Lawmakers who understand how precedent works find this terrifying, because norms do not disappear when one presidency ends. They persist, shaping what comes next. If they collapse now, they will not simply reappear later. This fear has transformed routine votes into flashpoints, policy disagreements into existential tests, and phone calls into confrontations about the future of institutional survival. All of this is unfolding against a backdrop of public confusion and exhaustion. Voters struggle to separate spectacle from substance, and that confusion is not accidental, it is strategic. A crowded information environment benefits leaders who thrive on chaos, and Trump has long understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability. That is why the convergence of these storylines matters so much. The war powers fight, the emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, and the stalled disclosures are not isolated controversies. They are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its intended limits. Republicans who once justified every move as temporary or tactical are now confronting a harder truth. Silence is no longer neutral. Inaction becomes a form of consent. That realization has shifted the internal tone of the party from loyalty to triage. The question is no longer how to help Trump dominate the next news cycle. It is how to prevent lasting damage to institutions that must continue to function after he is gone. That shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different. It is quieter, more procedural, but far more serious, because it is driven not by ideology, but by alarm. Alarm rooted in the understanding that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism begins to blur. Once that line fades, it rarely returns without cost. That cost is what some Republicans are now trying, perhaps belatedly, to avoid. And they are doing so even as Trump escalates his attacks, framing every attempt to limit his authority as an attack on the nation itself. In his mind, the two are inseparable. That belief, more than any single policy dispute, is what has pushed members of his own party into open resistance. While public debate focuses on war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter and more unsettling pressure is building beneath the surface. Each time the administration escalates its crisis language, it draws attention to what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, and the slow, methodical work of accountability. This is where the story takes a darker but more procedural turn, away from rumor and into the uncomfortable territory of process failures and unanswered questions. When lawmakers begin asking why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch on indefinitely, and why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they are not alleging wrongdoing. They are identifying red flags. Red flags are dangerous not because they prove guilt, but because they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed, dominance, and narrative control struggles to manage. The administration itself elevated transparency into a defining promise, emphasizing urgency and openness, yet the reality has unfolded far more slowly than the rhetoric suggested. When senators like Sheldon Whitehouse publicly describe the gap between expectation and execution, focusing on numbers, timelines, and compliance requirements rather than theories, the issue is reframed entirely. It becomes an administrative credibility test rather than a political talking point. Credibility is the currency of governance. Once it is questioned, every explanation faces higher skepticism. Requests for Inspector General review are not accusations. They are acknowledgments that something in the process failed, whether through mismanagement, delay, or competing priorities. And for an administration already facing internal revolt, this kind of inquiry compounds pressure in ways that cannot be dismissed with a speech or a tweet. Inspector General inquiries operate outside political theater. They deal in records, memos, timelines, and chains of decision-making. Their findings do not disappear with a rally or dissolve under social media pressure. That is precisely why they pose such a challenge to a presidency built around narrative dominance. And this is where Trump's broader strategy becomes clearer, not through any single statement, but through repetition. Each time scrutiny tightens, the narrative expands. Emergencies are declared. External threats are amplified. Attention shifts from documentation to confrontation, from compliance to control. It is not subtle. It is instinctive. Flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes, and hope the public moves on. But Congress is not an audience. It is a co-equal branch of government, and some lawmakers are beginning to behave like it again. Subpoenas are discussed. Financial trails are followed. Questions are asked about why certain oversight avenues were not pursued proactively if transparency was truly a priority. This is not about proving a predetermined outcome. It is about explaining a process. Processes do not have opinions or loyalties. They leave records. And records are stubborn. They do not respond to intimidation or rhetorical force. they simply exist. As this inquiry deepens, it collides directly with Trump's preferred mode of operation, which is personal control over information rather than institutional disclosure. That collision limits his ability to redefine reality on demand, and that loss of control is what he fears most. It explains why loyalty rhetoric has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, and why even bipartisan oversight is portrayed as partisan warfare. Accepting neutral review means accepting the possibility of outcomes you cannot dictate, and Trump has always treated control as inseparable from survival. This convergence is what has unsettled Republicans the most. War powers are being challenged. Emergency authorities are being questioned. Disclosure processes are under scrutiny. Party unity is fraying. And all of it is happening simultaneously. This is not a bad week or an unlucky sequence of headlines. It is a systems test, one that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top rather than from outside threats. Quietly, some Republicans are acknowledging that the greater risk is not what oversight might uncover, but what happens if oversight fails entirely. A system that cannot examine itself becomes brittle, and brittle systems do not bend, they break. This awareness has shifted internal conversations from defense to distance, from justification to insulation. Lawmakers are calculating how to separate their constitutional responsibilities from a presidency that increasingly treats those responsibilities as obstacles. And throughout it all, Trump continues to push forward, framing himself as besieged and unfairly constrained, leaning harder into the language of destiny and personal judgment. At the same time, the institutional machinery around him begins to move differently, slower, heavier, and more deliberately. Oversight does not rush, it accumulates, and that accumulation is difficult to outrun. No matter how many crises are declared or enemies are named, paper trails do not vanish, deadlines do not forget, procedures do not care about loyalty. That reality is what makes this moment feel heavier than previous controversies. It is no longer about what Trump says publicly. It is about what he cannot fully control. For a leader whose authority has always depended on dominating the narrative, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force he has faced. This is setting the stage for a confrontation that has nothing to do with ideology or elections, but everything to do with whether the institutions of government are still permitted to govern the person at the top. And that is why this story does not hinge on a single vote, a single phone call, or a single emergency declaration. It hinges on whether process still matters when power resists it, whether rules still hold when enforcement becomes inconvenient, and whether lawmakers, particularly those within the president's own party, are willing to endure political risk in defense of systems they may one day desperately need themselves. This is where the story ultimately settles, not in one dramatic vote or a single late-night phone call, and not even in the declaration of another national emergency, but in a reckoning that Republicans, Democrats, and the public can no longer delay. What is unfolding is not simply a clash of personalities or another cycle of outrage designed to dominate the news. It is a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office rather than from an external threat. The reason this moment feels heavier, more consequential than previous controversies, is that the resistance is no longer purely partisan. It is institutional, it is procedural, and it is being driven by lawmakers who may disagree fiercely on ideology, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth. Power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and enforced through intimidation eventually turns against the very system that gives it legitimacy. Republicans understand this, even when they hesitate to say it out loud. They know that shortcuts taken today do not belong to one president forever. They become precedents, and once those precedents exist, they belong to whoever comes next. That realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Votes are being cast not for applause, but for restraint. Oversight requests are framed not as attacks, but as necessities. Distance is being created not out of disloyalty, but out of self-preservation. History is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality, and more lawmakers are beginning to grasp that lesson in real time. Trump senses this shift, and that awareness explains why his rhetoric has sharpened, why his language has grown more apocalyptic, and why his reliance on emergency powers has intensified. Leaders who feel control slipping rarely slow down. They accelerate. They raise the stakes. They demand loyalty tests and insist that only they can protect the nation from collapse, even as their own actions generate the instability they warn against. That paradox sits at the center of this presidency's final phase. A leader obsessed with legacy, but increasingly constrained by process. A party torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival. And institutions forced to decide whether they will remain performative or functional when it matters most. For those watching from the outside, the temptation is to treat this as just another chapter in a long-running political drama, but that misses the point entirely. The real question is not whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It is whether the rules that govern power remain stronger than the individuals who temporarily hold it. That question does not belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters, to citizens, and to anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership.